15 years ago, a child and a local pastor vanished without a trace after Sunday service. No bodies, no crime scene, and no answers. Authorities closed the case, calling it a likely accident or runaway. But one mother never stopped searching, convinced the silence was hiding something far darker. Then, during a church renovation, workers uncovered something buried in the soil, something that would force the entire town to face what it chose to forget. Sunday evening descended upon Red Hollow with a thin mist, like the long sigh of time settling over the old gray wooden houses. The town nestled at the edge of the Maplewood forest, so quiet you could hear the wind whistling softly through the unsealed window frames. In the distance, St. Elora's Chapel stood tall like a forgotten tombstone, its broken bell tower as if someone had snapped the last bit of its soul. In the small house at the end of Cedar Street, Eleanor Rose placed 2 cups of tea on the wooden table, one with sugar, and she was all alone. The action was unprompted, unawaited, but it had repeated for 15 years like a silent ritual. She sat down in the chair by the window, her eyes fixed on the chapel, where the mossy walls were now being peeled away by the hands of restoration workers. The grandfather clock on the wall struck 3:30, then fell silent. This same hour, that day. Abigail had left the house, carrying her small purple backpack and the Sailor Moon comic book she loved most. Her footsteps were light, but the way she turned back, smiled and said, "I'll be back before dark. Don't worry, Mom." Eleanor still heard it as if it were yesterday, except she never came back. Eleanor lifted her cup of tea but didn't drink. The warmth from the porcelain did nothing to ease the coldness in her chest. The house was now devoid of laughter, the sound of slippers shuffling on the old wooden floors, only the wind and the echoes of memories silently knocking on the empty spaces that no one could name. Outside the window, St. Elora's had no bell. That bell, 15 years ago, had rung for the last time on the Sunday afternoon Abigail disappeared. A long, clear sound that faded into the forest as if wanting to drag both of them away with it. Abigail, the cheerful 10-year-old girl, and Pastor Thomas Caraway, the kindest man she had ever known. No one found the bodies, no blood, no evidence of a crime. Everything stopped like a change in the wind. Only Eleanor, the only one who hadn't left Red Hollow, still waited for an explanation that never came. The afternoon passed slowly. She was about to get up to water the lavender in front of the porch, the only living thing Abigail had ever planted, when the phone rang. The sound blared in the silence, making her freeze. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then picked up the receiver. "Mrs. Rose?" A man's voice, slightly unfamiliar. "I'm calling from the construction crew renovating St. Elora's. We found something you might want to know about." Eleanor gripped the phone tighter. "What is it?" "A notebook, slightly burned at the corner. It seems to belong to Pastor Thomas. We matched the handwriting and there's a rather strange line. We thought, it's best if you see it before we turn it over to the police." She stood silently for a long time. From the second year after the disappearance, the police had closed the case. The last note in the file: insufficient grounds for further investigation, possibly voluntary disappearance or accident. As if a child afraid of the woods, who had never gone anywhere without telling her mother, could voluntarily leave. She hung up. Without a word, Eleanor put on her coat, buttoning it one by one, her hands still trembling slightly. She didn't know what she was about to face, but in her heart, something strange flickered, something like a ray of hope. Or was it fear? On the way to St. Elora's, she called the former police chief, Mr. Milner, who had headed the investigation that year. After a few rings, a hoarse voice answered. "Milner speaking. I need to see you, about Abigail." A long silence followed. "Mrs. Eleanor, that was a long time ago. I really don't know what more there is to say. They just found Pastor Thomas's diary. At the chapel." A sigh. "If there's anything new, I'm sure the investigation team will handle it. I'm I'm no longer in the force." Eleanor didn't answer. She hung up, her heart aching again. Not because he refused, but because of what she had known for a long time. No one wanted to dig up that pain. Except her. St. Alora's emerged, halfway shrouded in the evening mist. Scaffolding surrounded the cracked bell tower, some tarpaulins covering the stained glass windows that had become tarnished. A group of workers sat smoking near the dirt patch behind where the chapel's small garden used to be. A young man, probably around 30, approached. "Are you Mrs. Rose?" "I am." He led her around to the back. The wind whistled through the old trees, dry leaves rustling underfoot. Then he pointed to a wooden table covered in dust. On it lay a thick plastic bag. Inside was a leather notebook, faded in color and burned at one corner. "We found it while clearing the ground near the back wall. There was also a pair of small shoes, red, and an old doll." Eleanor didn't speak. She placed her hand on the plastic bag. Her fingers trembled, like touching a dead memory, but still with a breath of life. In the notebook, there's a line. We don't quite understand it, but it mentions, "If I disappear, check the ledger entry for September 3rd. She stopped, immediately. Very slowly, Eleanor raised her head. Who was the church's financial auditor that year? No one answered immediately. The wind blew, making the tarpaulin flutter like tearing paper. The worker looked around, confused, but Eleanor already knew the answer, and she understood. The journey she had been ready to walk for a lifetime. Now, finally, had started again. Once more. No longer the waiting mother, but the mother who would track down, at any cost. On a bleak Monday morning, Red Hollow was still shrouded in fog so thick one could imagine the entire town breathing slowly. Behind St. Alora's chapel, the uneven ground churned up by machinery still bore streaks of wet, reddish-brown soil. The workers had erected a temporary tent covering the newly dug hole, not because of rain, but because what they had found was no longer building material. A pair of small red shoes, the fabric faded with time, the soles almost completely rotten but still retaining their shape. Placed beside them was a cloth doll without hair, a body of cotton fabric that had crumbled, a face that had once been meticulously embroidered, now only 2 black stitch holes like hollow eyes. Eleanor stood a few steps away, her hands deep in the pockets of her long coat. No one had asked her to be there, but the worker who had called the day before had not forbidden it. And she understood. She needed to see it with her own eyes. The police had also arrived, 2 uniformed officers kneeling by the hole, wearing gloves, carefully lifting each object from the thin layer of soil, as if excavating someone's memories. A young officer, blonde, fresh-faced, probably newly transferred to Red Hollow, turned to his partner. "Are you sure these shoes belong to the missing girl?" "Can't be officially confirmed," the other replied cautiously. "But the size matches. Color, descriptions from the file that year are also the same. We'll need to cross-reference archival photos." Eleanor didn't move. She had washed those shoes dozens of times, carefully drying them on the line in the back garden, lining them with newspaper to keep their shape. No need to verify. She knew it well. However, the item that made the group stop and make calls repeatedly was a small leather notebook, one corner burned, covered in dry soil, lying under a layer of roots. Inside, the first page still bore the intact, slanted black ink, clearly the handwriting of Pastor Thomas Carraway. A firm script, slightly inclined to the right, so familiar that Eleanor only needed a glance to recognize it. An officer carefully used tweezers to turn each page. Many passages were smudged. Some lines of text were broken off, but in the middle, clipped between 2 thin sheets of paper, was a $1 bill. Old, frayed, with the words, "Help me," printed hastily in red like blood. Everyone fell silent. The young policeman frowned, his voice lowered almost to a whisper. "Is that real blood?" The other nodded, signaling to the forensic technician who was examining the samples a few meters away. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to suppress the dizziness rising in her chest. She didn't want to faint, not now, not when everything she had tried to keep inside for so many years was materializing right before her eyes. "We'll have to send it back to the lab for analysis," someone said, turning to her, his voice polite but wary, "and file a report to send to superiors for review. But, Mrs. Eleanor, you know the procedure. It's not certain the case will be reopened based solely on these things." She didn't react immediately. The wind blew, gently pushing the gray hair behind her neck. Her eyes closed slightly. Just for a second, to collect all the feelings welling up from within. When she opened her eyes, her voice was strangely calm. "He said the same thing that year." "Who?" "Police Chief Milner. That there wasn't enough evidence. That my daughter could have run away. But today," she walked slowly closer, "you found her shoes, and Pastor Thomas's diary. And that line, who do you think wrote it if not someone about to die?" The young policeman looked at her, his eyes wavering between guilt and embarrassment. "I understand, ma'am, but the procedure—" "The procedure?" Eleanor repeated, a faint smile flitting across her lips. "What procedure buried 2 people for 15 years and then said no one knew anything?" Silence. Another gust of wind blew, making the tarpaulin covering the evidence flutter slightly like an invisible reminder. At the same time, the technician approached, holding a rapid testing kit. He nodded to the investigation team, his voice firm. "It's human blood, fresh when written, not from the environment." The older policeman frowned, then sighed. "I'll call the new sheriff's office. Maybe open a preliminary investigation again. But don't expect much, ma'am. We still have to get approval." Eleanor nodded, saying nothing more. But inside, something had shifted. Not hope. Eleanor hadn't used that word for a long time, but something close to hope, a sense of awakening. She looked around the area. This place, about 30 meters from the chapel, it used to be a herb garden. Pastor Thomas used to grow lavender and rosemary to give to elderly parishioners. A peaceful, simple place. And now, this place spoke to what for 15 years no one had been willing to believe. Something very wrong had happened in St. Alora's chapel that day. She turned away. But before leaving the fenced-off area, Eleanor said softly, not loudly, but loud enough for the 2 policemen to hear, "Mr. Charles Reamer was in charge of the church's finances that year." The 2 men looked at each other. The name was not unfamiliar. In this small town, everyone knew Charles Reamer. A successful businessman, a community benefactor, who always appeared in a gray suit and a polite smile at every grand ceremony. Only, in the 2008 missing person file, that name had never been mentioned. Eleanor didn't need to look to know that it confused them. And for the first time in many years, she felt she was no longer alone in the face of bowed heads and averted eyes. Memories never fade, but now it was no longer a burden she had to bear alone. She walked away, leaving behind the smell of damp earth, the whispers of people trying to reimagine what had been buried. And in her heart, the silent promise to herself became clearer than ever. "You were never properly protected, Abby. But now, I won't let anyone bury you again." The town of Marlow was about 17 minutes' drive from Red Hollow, crossing a small iron bridge and a narrow maple-lined road. In this season, yellow leaves littered both sides of the road, forming a rustling carpet each time a tire passed over. There was nothing remarkable about this place, except for a laundromat, a family pharmacy, and a coffee shop called Lou's, where Eleanor was sitting, holding a cup of coffee that was cooling in front of her. This corner of the shop was the same as before. Scratched wooden tables, foggy window panes, and an old radio playing an 80s love song, the singing so soft it was almost part of the wind. Eleanor couldn't hear the words clearly, but her mind was focused on someone else, the man she hadn't seen for over a decade. The door opened, the bell jingling. Jacob Kingsley walked in, bringing with him the smell of burning wood and something of fresh grass. He was much changed, salt and pepper hair, stubble, an old brown coat worn at the cuffs, but his gait was still the same, steady, decisive, as if even after leaving the world of investigation, he had never lost his way. "Eleanor," he called out in a soft voice, unsure whether to call her Mrs. or Eleanor, as they had when they worked together that year. Eleanor nodded, smiling lightly, pointing to the chair opposite. "Sit down. I think you'll want to see this." She placed the photos of the old leather notebook she had obtained from the police on the table. The light from the window shone on the pictures, highlighting the black burn marks and the ink-stained edges of the paper. Jacob didn't touch them right away. He looked at Eleanor for a long time, as if measuring how much she had had to trade to get it in her hands. Then he opened the notebook, turning each page with his bare hands. "It's Thomas's handwriting, no doubt about it." His voice held no surprise, only a heaviness, as if someone had just met the old memories they thought had been buried. "I remember you saying you didn't believe that Thomas and Abigail disappeared voluntarily." Eleanor spoke slowly, her eyes not leaving his hands as he traced each line of text. "That's right." Jacob nodded slightly. "And I was suspended for 3 weeks after questioning the strange coincidence between the donation of money from an unclear source and the moment they disappeared. But back then, no one wanted to listen. Now maybe they'll have to listen." Jacob looked up at Eleanor. His eyes, once the guiding light for many complex cases, now seemed to have found a reason to exist again. "Do you know," he said, "the line, 'If I disappear, check the ledger entry for September 3rd' is the most valuable cry for help I've ever seen. It's not just a warning, it's evidence. Thomas saw something." He turned to the photo of the book page with the $1 bill clipped in between. His lips pursed tightly as he looked at the words, "Help me," written in blood. The person who wrote this line didn't think he would live much longer. The way Thomas wrote his diary before was steady, describing work, doctrine, notes on parishioners. But the last 3 pages completely switched to a cautious writing style. The words were more urgent, with repeated words. "This is the language of someone who is threatened." Eleanor was silent. She didn't need scientific evidence to believe. She believed because being a mother didn't need evidence. But when she heard Jacob analyze it like that, what she felt was relief. Someone understood. Someone saw. "Do you remember the Red Hollow Social Trust Fund?" Eleanor asked. Jacob nodded. "With Charles Remmer as the honorary name." "Right. I want to know, who was the internal auditor that year?" Jacob tilted his head in thought for a moment. "Linda Voss." Eleanor closed her eyes, just as she remembered. Jacob pondered, then asked, "Have you found her yet?" "Not yet. I'm not sure if she's still alive here." "She moved to Forest Hollow after Thomas disappeared. I heard that, before I was transferred." No one spoke for a moment. Outside, the fog still shrouded the deserted street. A shop employee passed by, placing another pot of coffee, but Eleanor didn't pour more. Jacob pushed his glasses up his nose, leaned back in his chair, looking at Eleanor longer than usual. "Are you sure you're ready to continue?" Eleanor laughed lightly, dryly, and almost voicelessly. "Do you think I've lived the last 15 years waiting for someone else to do it for me?" Jacob also laughed, for the first time in the meeting. It was a sad smile, of 2 people who had grown old because of nameless pain, but still had faith in what people call justice. "Then we'll start again from September 3rd. He picked up the notebook, flipping quickly to the part with the words crossed out many times. "What do you see?" Eleanor asked. Jacob pointed to a word that had been written and crossed out many times until the paper tore, "Donor." Thomas knew the identity of the anonymous donor, he said, but he was so afraid he didn't dare write it out directly, just repeating, "That person knows, that person is present." And on September 3rd, the church fund received a huge cash donation. $120,000, Eleanor whispered. Jacob looked at her, his eyes now as if they had shed a thick layer of dust of years. "We don't need them to reopen the case, at least not yet. We'll do it ourselves. You're no longer an investigator. But I still have a good memory and a few relationships that haven't been turned off." A short smile flashed across. Outside, the sky began to clear. Weak rays of light shone through the mist, through the coffee shop glass, illuminating the table between them, where the small notebook lay, like a door that had just been cracked open after 15 years of being locked tight. The search was no longer a painful dream alone. Now, Eleanor had Jacob, and the memory of an investigator who had been sidelined was becoming a torch illuminating the old path again. The church archives lay quietly after a little-known turn in the town of Grey Ridge, a place that locals often called the Old Convent. The red brick building, 3 stories high, used to be a small monastery for the Carmel nuns, now a repository for all activities of the diocese in the area. No signs, no guards, only a faded white-painted door with the small words, "Pastoral Archives, no admittance without authorization." Jacob knocked 3 times before a thin man, wearing a cardigan and glasses perched on his nose, opened the door slightly. After a few introductions and Jacob's old employee card, now as dilapidated as the evidence of time, was presented, both were led into a closed room, dark wood paneled, the smell of old paper and mildew mingling in the air like the smell of memories that had been forgotten. "We're looking for St. Elora's Church fund ledgers from 2008, especially from August to October," Jacob said, his voice both soft and firm. "Original documents, if they still exist." The librarian asked no more questions. He pointed to an old row of filing cabinets, section 4E, then quietly withdrew. The remaining space was the sound of turning pages, the rustle of footsteps on the old carpet, and the ticking of the clock echoing through the silence of souls that had no resting place. Eleanor wore white fabric gloves, her hand trembling slightly as she pulled each file out of the drawer. The old papers were carefully folded, arranged by month. September 2008. She pulled out the thickest file. "Here it is." Jacob's voice sounded softly. He opened the ledger in handwritten ink, the script as thin as a thread, writing each line carefully. The first page of September, right in the middle of the table. September 3rd, 2008. Cash donation, $120,000. Note, contribution for repairing the tiles of St. Elora's Chapel recipient and approver, Charles Remer. No one spoke for a few minutes. Eleanor stared at the name Charles Remer in capital letters in black ink. The pen stroke firm as if the writer wanted to assert that his presence was irreplaceable. "Repairing the tiles?" Eleanor said in a voice as dry maple leaves trampled underfoot. "The roof of St. Elora's Chapel was not repaired that year," Jacob said slowly. "I remember clearly, because in October of that year, I attended a memorial service. The roof was still leaking, and the broken tiles were still intact." He flipped to a few pages later, comparing the expenses. There was no construction cost note, no contracts, no invoices from workers, no acceptance records. "This is money that was given out but never used legally," he concluded. "And who confirmed it?" Eleanor asked, although she knew the answer. "Charles Remer, the approver. And no one asked questions." Eleanor leaned lightly against the wooden back of the chair, her hands gripping the armrests tightly until the knuckles turned white. She wasn't surprised. Nothing surprised her anymore. But the feeling of being betrayed, of being looked down upon, that feeling was still intact, like a sharp needle piercing the palm of her hand every time Charles's name was mentioned with respect on local radio broadcasts. "They let him launder money through the church," she whispered. Jacob nodded, still staring at the detailed statement. Among the hundreds of contributions, most were a few $100s at a time. Only the $120,000 was cash, no transfer source, no payer's name. "Cash," he said, "doesn't leave a trace on the banking system, easy to launder, easy to disappear." And he turned it into something sacred, Eleanor said bitterly. A roof that doesn't exist. Jacob sat up straight, his eyes changing. Very slowly, he took out an old photo from his pocket. A photo of the Sunday afternoon service when Abigail disappeared. A black and white photo, hazy, taken from behind the parishioners. He pointed to a familiar silhouette. A tall man, gray hair, wearing a suit, shaking hands with Pastor Thomas on the steps of the chapel. Charles was there that day. Eleanor looked closely, her hand gently placed on the photo. They never mentioned him in any of the statements. Because no one asked, Jacob replied. And he never said. She didn't answer, but her eyes left the photo, stopping at the ledger open in front of her. The whole room seemed to shrink, leaving only the small distance between two lines. Recipient, Charles Romer, and reason for payment, repairing the tiles. Between those two lines was the truth, the unconfirmed death, the bell that stopped ringing. Jacob closed the ledger, carefully placing it in the hard file bag. We have a good reason to request a search of related accounts, but I need more. A link. Eleanor didn't blink. She was reimagining Charles's face, the person who for so many years still shook her hand every Christmas, still smiled and stood next to other children at the charity gift distribution. A person who knew how to hide not only money, but also the truth. I'll find Linda Voss, she said. She's the only one who knows what really happened with the books. If Pastor Thomas went to her, then she's the link you need. Jacob looked at her, his eyes half skeptical, half sympathetic. Are you ready? This is no longer about collecting files. We're about to step into the darkest part of that church. Eleanor took a deep breath. The scent of old paper, dust, and ink soaked into her lungs. Her eyes were slightly blurred, but not from tears, but from anger, the emotion she had suppressed for 15 years now stirring to life again. I don't need light to move forward, she said. I just need to know that I'm not walking alone. Jacob nodded, and the two left the storage room, carrying with them the silence of hundreds of files that had never been turned over, and a name that had now emerged between the lines. Charles Romer, a community benefactor, and perhaps the one who caused the town's oldest crime. Linda Voss's house was nestled behind a row of tall pines in the town of Forest Hollow, more than 20 miles from Red Hollow via a mountain road, a place people passed through more than stopped at. There was no clear house number, no doorbell, just a small gray wooden house with a withered bougainvillea vine covering the railing, as if wanting to obscure the entire past. Eleanor stood before the gate, holding the shawl that was slipping off her shoulder, while Jacob stepped back a few steps, letting her go first. The afternoon wind whistled through the leaves, carrying the sound of their footsteps snaking into the quiet yard. When she knocked on the door 3 times, there was no answer. Again, still silent. She was about to turn away when the door opened, a narrow crack, and then the face of a woman with long gray hair tied loosely, dark circles under her eyes, and a wary look like a wild animal. I don't receive guests. The voice was hoarse, brief, as if she had never talked to anyone for many years. Eleanor didn't retreat. She just said one sentence, very softly. We've come because of Abigail. Linda paused. Those eyes, almost devoid of vitality, trembled slightly, and the hand holding the doorknob tightened until it turned white. I thought that was over. It's never been over, Eleanor replied, looking straight into her eyes. Not with me, not with her. Linda was silent for a few seconds, then opened the door wider. Without saying anything more, she just motioned for them to come in. Jacob and Eleanor followed her around to the backyard, a small, neglected garden, the grass overgrown, but in the middle there was still a round wooden table and 2 broken-backed armchairs. Linda made tea herself, slowly, as a ritual. No one spoke. It wasn't until 3 cups of tea were placed on the table, the scent of lavender and mint spreading, that she spoke. I've been waiting for this day, but always hoped it wouldn't come. Eleanor didn't interrupt. She waited. Pastor Thomas, was the last kind man left in St. Elora. He never asked where the money came from until he saw the amount larger than the annual budget was written in one line: roof sponsorship. He came to find me. Linda stopped, her eyes looking far away through the dilapidated fence, as if seeing again the image of an autumn afternoon 15 years ago. I was the deputy bookkeeper for the fund. He said, "Linda, I don't need to know who sent it. I just need to know something's not right." I told him to be careful, that people don't like being questioned when they're wearing angel's robes. Jacob interjected, his voice as light as the wind. "Charles Remmer?" Linda nodded, not denying it. I never saw him hand over the money in person. There was always an intermediary, but every wire ended with his signature, and that was enough to scare Thomas. Scare? Eleanor leaned forward. Linda nodded, her hand unconsciously wrapping tightly around her knitted sleeve. I received an unsigned envelope left in my desk drawer. Inside was a blank piece of paper with the line printed from a computer. "You're paid to keep the books, not to read them." Her voice broke. I resigned that week. I was going to tell the police, but when Thomas disappeared, I understood everything I said would only turn me into the next one. Eleanor squeezed the edge of the table. "And Abigail?" Linda looked at her. For the first time, her eyes filled with real pain. "I think she saw something. Once I caught her in the administration room, holding Pastor Thomas's notebook. She said, 'I see Mr. Thomas writing strange numbers. He told me not to tell anyone.'" Eleanor closed her eyes. That sentence was like a knife stabbing into the heart. A week later, both of them disappeared. Jacob said softly. Linda nodded. I was silent. I didn't save anyone. No one spoke for a long time, only the sound of the wind blowing through the dry branches, and the tiny sound when the spoon stirred the tea hit the rim of the cup. Eleanor placed her hand on the table, gently but firmly. "You may not have been able to save anyone that day, but today you can help me not let this be buried again." Linda looked at her, then looked at Jacob, then looked down at her hands. After a moment, she stood up, going inside. When she returned, in her hand was an old wooden box. Inside are copies of the detailed statements I saved before I resigned. I always thought one day someone would ask, but no one ever asked. Jacob opened the box, taking out the old paper copies. Some of the ink had faded, but were still clear enough to read. Some items were circled, marked in red. There was a prominent line marked September 3rd. Internal transfer from relief fund, unreported repair cost ledger. "This is what Pastor Thomas saw," Jacob murmured. Linda sat down, her hands trembling. "I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't think I deserve it. But if my words can still help, I'm ready to testify." Eleanor said nothing. She just reached out, gently touching Linda's trembling hand. Not forgiveness, just recognition. All silence can be broken if people are brave enough to speak again. And now Linda had chosen to speak. In the old backyard, between the dry leaves and the sealed memories, a confession had found someone to listen to. And the truth, though buried for 15 years, had just revealed the first crack of light. The dirt road leading to the Red Hollow Social Trust warehouse had no signs, nor was it on any town maps. It lurked behind a trail only locals knew, where weeds grew knee-high and old maple trees intertwined, as if wanting to keep the secrets of this place at all costs. Local builders called it by a simple, creepy name, the Silent Warehouse, because for many years no one had seen people coming in and out, nor had they ever heard any noise from within. But Jacob knew well, any place that was too quiet was suspicious. It took more than a week to have a lawyer in the neighboring state send a search warrant request, because Charles Remmer, the person who owned the warehouse, was the honorary chairman of the fund, and also had connections so wide that the Red Hollow Police Department was still hesitant to touch any property related to him. But this time, thanks to the evidence from Linda Voss and Pastor Thomas's notebook, a young judge agreed to issue an order, on the condition that the access team be accompanied by legal representation. That morning, Eleanor and Jacob stood before the large gray-brown iron door that had rusted, the sun not yet reaching the roof. The smell of mildew rose from the layer of decayed leaves around the base of the wall, mixed with the smell of old oil and thyme. "Are you sure this is the place Charles used?" Eleanor asked, her eyes still fixed on the door that was as tall as two people. "According to land records, this building is listed as a temporary relief warehouse, but—" Jacob opened his notebook, pointing to a line. "In 2008, it was registered for interior renovation. September, right when the $120,000 donation disappeared from the books." The legal representative accompanying them was a young woman named Clara. She checked the search warrant one last time, nodded to Jacob, and signaled the technical team to break the lock. The door burst open with a long crack, echoing like the metal complaining. The air inside immediately poured out, cold, suffocating, and thick, making Eleanor shiver. The initial space was a large, empty room, with only a few old wooden boxes and rows of rusty shelves. But Jacob didn't care about the surface. He scanned each wall, tapping lightly at a steady rhythm. When he reached the west wall, the echo changed. The sound was heavier and denser. Jacob stopped, looking at Clara. She nodded. After nearly 10 minutes of dismantling, a large sheet of plywood was lifted off, revealing a small metal door behind it. There was no handle, no hinges. A hidden room. Clara provided a flashlight. Jacob skillfully pried open the door with a crowbar. An opening appeared, revealing a narrow corridor, just wide enough for one person to pass through. "Only one person can go at a time," Jacob said, his voice lost in the stifling space. He stepped in first. Eleanor followed, each step as cautious as if each brick underfoot could break at any moment. The hidden room was a small chamber, thick wood-paneled walls, with soundproofing inside. On the ceiling was a broken fluorescent light that had been out for a long time, and in the corner of the room was an old, torn carpet, covered with a thick layer of dust. Jacob knelt down, sweeping around with the flashlight. "Someone was once held here," he said softly. Eleanor didn't answer. She was staring at the carpet. There was something under the edge. She stepped forward, knelt down, lifting a corner slightly. A torn piece of photo paper was revealed. The back was stained with time, but the front was part of a black and white photo. A girl, about 10 years old, was sitting on a wooden bench, her hair slightly curly, holding a Sailor Moon comic book in front of her chest. Although the photo was torn diagonally, the girl's face was still clear. Abigail. She didn't remember when she had sat down. Jacob's flashlight was misdirected, but she didn't notice. The tiny photo lay in her hand, trembling, as if reclaiming the existence that had been stolen. "There's blood," Jacob called softly, the light shining on a reddish-brown stain on the baseboard right behind a loose piece of wood. "I'll take samples for testing." A long strand of light brown hair clung to the wood where Jacob was scanning. No one spoke for a few minutes, only the small sound of Eleanor breathing rapidly, then gradually regaining her rhythm. The girl was here. Her voice rose, strangely calm. Maybe locked up, maybe threatened, but was here. Jacob stood up, stepping closer. "There are no bodies, but we don't need them anymore. This photo, the blood, the hair, everything matches Linda's account. And it matches every question Pastor Thomas left," Eleanor said. The room darkened like a smoldering lump of ash, but in that suffocation, something became clear. No longer suspicion, no longer intuition, but confirmation, evidence, an undeniable presence. When they left the room, Clara had called for more forensic teams. Eleanor stepped out slowly, the midday light making her eyes sting with tears. But she didn't wipe them. She let the tears fall, without wailing, without complaining. Just something that poured out when a mother could finally say one sentence. "You were here. I know it now, Abby." The wind rose. Dry leaves rustled on the side of the dirt road. But this time, Eleanor no longer felt cold, because she knew this painful journey had touched a real point, a truth engraved into the very ground, and now no one could erase it. Late afternoon, the red hollow sky turned the color of burned copper like a slow-drawing curtain, so slow that one could almost hear the sound of time turning each calendar page. St. Alora's, the town's old chapel, was no longer a place of preaching, but a new space. The Rose Room, a community library named after a child who never had the chance to grow up. The restoration work had stopped after the events at Town Hall. No one came here anymore. No one dared to knock on the rotting wooden door, as if with just a light push, the truth would pour out like an ancient smoke. Eleanor stood before the steps, clutching the old set of keys Jacob had taken from the archives. They were the keys to Pastor Thomas's office, untouched for 15 years. The door opened with a long creak, echoing through the silent hallway. The familiar smell of old paper, oak, and something like lingering incense made Eleanor pause at the threshold. The room was not large, the walls paneled with wood, the old-fashioned bookshelves reaching the ceiling, the desk placed near the window with the light of the late day shining obliquely on the dusty surface. "Do you think it might still be here?" Eleanor asked, her voice small, her eyes not leaving the bookshelves where Thomas used to sit reading scriptures every morning. "Linda said he used to hide a recording device," Jacob replied. "We just need to find the right way." They divided up, scanning every corner of the room. Jacob turned the rug over, checking the desk drawers. Eleanor walked along the bookshelves, touching each stack of files. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but there were no signs of ransacking. It seemed the place had been frozen since the day Thomas disappeared. When Eleanor sat down in the large wooden chair opposite the desk, her hand unconsciously glided along the edge of the chair. Then she paused. There was something under the bottom. "Jacob." He turned around. Eleanor leaned over, reaching under the chair, and touched something hard, small as a matchbox. She pulled out a black device, covered in dust, an old-fashioned handheld recorder with mechanical buttons. The word Sony was fading on the body. Jacob took a paper towel, wiped it clean, and checked the battery. Strangely, the device still worked. He pressed the button. A buzzing sound rang out. A moment of silence. Then, "This is my personal diary. Thomas Carraway." His voice was deep, hoarse, no longer the voice of a preaching pastor, but of a man recording his last thoughts in a state of unease. "I don't know how much time I have left, but if someone finds this machine, I beg you to listen to the end." Eleanor didn't move. She sat up straight, her eyes wide but as if not seeing anything. The whole world now was just that voice. "I've discovered something in the church fund ledger. Sums of money too large, from unidentified sources, disguised as donations to the community. I asked Linda. She's afraid, and I understand why." A pause. "The person behind it. I don't dare write the name, but he controls the whole town. And if I disappear, it's not because I gave up, but because someone is afraid I'll tell the truth." A gasp rang out on the tape, as if he was trying to keep calm. "Abigail, that child. I don't know what to do. I think she saw or heard something. Maybe when I was checking the documents. She's curious, much smarter than her age." Eleanor gripped the armrest tightly, her eyes stinging. "If Abigail also disappears, please believe she's just a victim. Don't let her be blamed for the silence of adults." The recording ended with a slight hiss, then fell silent. The room was plunged into absolute stillness. Eleanor lowered her head to the table, her hands covering her face. Not because of the pain, not because of regret, but a new feeling after so many years: confirmation. She no longer had to doubt her memory, her intuition, or the love of a mother that had been called delusional for over a decade. She had been right. Thomas had been right. And now, he had just said it. though from the other side of death. Jacob stood silently to the side, his eyes red but saying nothing. There are moments that don't need words, just presence. Eleanor raised her head, took out a handkerchief and wiped away the tears. "He tried to save her," she whispered. "And now he's saving justice," Jacob added. They backed up the recording to a USB, sealed the device, and noted the time and location of discovery. But those procedures were just formalities. The biggest evidence was what Eleanor carried out of that room: the revival of faith. No longer blind faith, but faith that had been tested, strangled, crushed, and still survived. When they left the chapel, the sun had set behind the trees to the west, leaving faint light falling on the stained glass windows, casting oblique shadows on the stone floor like the last streaks of light remaining from a soul that had departed, but still continued to speak. And Eleanor, for the first time in 15 years, believed that what she was doing was not just finding the past, but was fixing an unfinished vow. That morning, the red hollow sky was so blue it was almost mocking. The fluffy white clouds drifted slowly like a peaceful picture deliberately drawn to hide something deeper, darker. In front of the town hall, rows of seats were arranged neatly, covered with a white arched roof, decorated with blue and gold ribbons, the colors of the Red Hollow Social Trust. The event today was the opening of the town's new library, named after one of its greatest benefactors in 2 decades, Mr. Charles Remer. Eleanor sat in the last row, her hat pulled low, her hands resting neatly in her lap. She didn't come to applaud. She came to look straight at the man who for the past 15 years the whole town had praised as a benefactor. The man who had shaken Abigail's hand, who had spoken at church services, and who had smiled and stood next to the children he didn't deserve to touch. When Charles stepped onto the stage, the atmosphere erupted in thunderous applause. He was still the same: tall, neatly combed gray hair, a wrinkle-free suit, a confident, calm, polite smile. His voice rang out through the microphone. "I don't think I'm special. I'm just lucky to be able to give back a small portion of what life has given me." The humble, fabricated words continued, but Eleanor could no longer hear clearly. Her eyes stopped at the hand he was holding the speech, his hand not trembling, not remorseful. She wondered, can a person sleep peacefully every night knowing that under the concrete he contributed is the blood of a child? Is he still a person? Behind the podium, in the small council chamber, Jacob was opening his personal laptop. He wasn't here to listen to the speech. He was here to receive a file. The screen displayed the words, "Sent from anonymous source, open with 2-layer authentication code." A message had been timed in advance. "If I disappear, transfer everything to the State Justice Department. Sender, unknown." But Jacob guessed who was behind it. 3 days ago, he received a handwritten letter in his mailbox, with no sender's name, only the line, "I used to work for NCE Bank, credit funding branch. I used to handle Charles Remer's account." The file attached was a series of bank statements with cash deposits from unnamed organizations through intermediary accounts, then transferred to the Community Fund and recorded in the St. Elora's Church Fund ledger. Total, over $3.2 million in 5 years, all in cash. Jacob's eyes stopped at the last line of a statement. September 3rd, 2008. Internal transfer, $120,000. Purpose: repair St. Elora's tiles. He closed the laptop, his eyes chilling. No need to search further. What they needed now was not paperwork, but a timely snip to tear the mask. Outside, Charles had just finished his speech with a resounding round of applause. As he stepped off the podium, Eleanor stood up, not taking her eyes off him. She took slow steps towards the side wing of the stage, where he was being surrounded by charity groups and some town representatives. Charles noticed her from afar. He raised his eyebrows slightly, not recognizing her immediately. Then his eyes paused as the memory flashed. Eleanor, The mother who had stayed in Red Hollow when everyone else had left. The person he had smiled and greeted every Sunday morning with eyes as if nothing wrong had ever happened. "Mrs. Rose," he nodded. "Long time no see. I am very sorry about your daughter." "You don't need to be sorry," Eleanor said. Her voice was calm, but each word was sharpened. "Because all regret is meaningless if it's not accompanied by the truth." Charles chuckled slightly, tilting his head slightly, looking confused. "I don't understand." "I think you understand better than anyone here," Eleanor interrupted. "And you should know, people are starting to turn over the past." His eyes twitched slightly. At the same time, the phone in Charles's vest pocket rang. He glanced quickly at the screen. For a moment, his expression changed color. It was unclear whether it was anger or fear, but Eleanor recognized it immediately. For the first time in 15 years, Charles Raymer's expression was no longer perfect. Jacob stepped out from the stage wing on the other side, holding a file. "Sorry for ruining the ceremony," he said loudly, enough for a few people to turn around. "But I think a few questions should be asked right now." A town employee tried to stop him, but Jacob had handed the file including all the evidence collected to the police officer standing nearby, who belonged to the state's special investigation team, newly transferred 2 days ago. Charles was about to walk away, but was blocked. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes no longer resentful, only what she had kept through all the years, the truth. "How many roofs do you think you can hide behind?" she asked softly. "Silence is not a brick wall, Charles. It doesn't protect anyone." He didn't answer, but he knew she was right. And before the crowd could understand what was happening, Charles Raymer, the community benefactor of generations, was invited to leave the stage with a pair of metal handcuffs silently sparkling in the midday sun. No one applauded. No one cried. Only the sound of the wind blowing through the gradually emptying rows of seats, carrying the echo of a shortened ceremony, and a stripped bare shell. In Eleanor's eyes, it wasn't a victory, but the first step of justice. A justice that didn't need blood, just that no one remained silent. The Mapleton County courtroom was packed that morning. More than half the seats for the public had been taken early. People from Red Hollow came as if attending a large ceremony. But no one applauded, no one talked or laughed. Silence enveloped the neatly paneled wooden room, where light from the high windows poured down like straight swords, punishing and illuminating. In the second row, Eleanor sat silently, wearing an unadorned black dress, her wrists crossed in her lap. Her hair was neatly bunned without makeup. In her coat pocket was a small, folded piece of paper, a line from Pastor Thomas's diary that she had handwritten in purple ink. "If Abigail also disappears, please believe." At the defendant's table, Charles Raymer sat calmly, his carefully tailored light gray suit, blue tie, posture as if he was attending an annual meeting rather than facing charges of first-degree murder, obstructing a criminal investigation, and laundering money through a religious organization. He wasn't handcuffed, at least until convicted, but the 2 police officers standing on either side were enough to remind everyone. This position was no longer his stage. "Your Honor," the defense attorney began, "my client pleads not guilty to all charges. Mr. Raymer is a model citizen who has donated millions of dollars to the community, funding libraries, hospitals, scholarship programs." Eleanor didn't listen further. She had heard those words for so many years, on local television, in town meetings, even at church services. They called him the savior of Red Hollow. But no one asked, saving with what and from whom? The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, thin-rimmed glasses, spoke in a voice that didn't need to be loud to silence the courtroom. "We don't have a body. We don't have a direct witness, but we have something more important. Indirect evidence that is consistent, logical, and convincing enough." She raised each document. Pastor Thomas's diary, with a specific warning note about the money from September 3rd and the threat to his life. the audio recording capturing Thomas's voice, confirming his fear of Abigail's existence as an accidental witness. The testimony of Linda Voss, the church accountant, admitting to being indirectly threatened and witnessing irregularities in the financial records. Evidence from the warehouse, bloodstains, hair strands, a photo of Abigail in an unnatural pose. Bank statements and financial records from the anonymous whistleblower, proving the flow of cash from obscure sources to the Red Hollow Community Fund account. A third of the courtroom burst into tears when the torn photo of Abigail was shown on the large screen. The rest didn't look away, they just bowed their heads. Charles sat still, showing no emotion. "People call him the giver," the prosecutor said. "But in the dark, he built an empire from silence and fear. We don't need corpses to know that two people are dead. We need the truth to allow justice to live." In the defense, Charles's lawyer repeatedly dismissed the evidence as sentimental, lacking scientific basis, and not directly accusatory. But each argument was rebuffed by the consistency of the leads. Each detail, each testimony, each piece of paper fit together like the spine of a buried body, now gradually rising. Throughout the 18-day trial, Eleanor didn't leave her position. She didn't go to the press, didn't make statements, just observed. In the final cross-examination, the lawyer asked Charles, "Have you ever known or met Abigail Eleanor Rose?" Charles turned his head, looking towards the public. His face, for a moment, cracked. Not much, but enough for Eleanor to know. He had realized he could no longer hide. "I can't remember clearly." Behind Eleanor, a woman exclaimed aloud, "Can't remember!" Her voice choked. Someone patted her shoulder. Someone else bowed their head. The trial ended on Friday afternoon, as the early winter wind began to whistle through the high window slits. The jury took less than 2 hours to return. The foreman stood up, holding the ballot as if carrying the town's entire memory. "We agree. The defendant, Charles Remmer, is guilty." There was no cheering. No one cried. In the whole courtroom, there was only the sound of reporters' pens and the judge's voice reading the sentence. For the crimes including first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and using a religious organization to launder money and cover up illegal activities, the defendant Charles Remmer is sentenced to 37 years in prison. The number rang out in the room like a bell, not as long as the years Eleanor had waited, but enough for her to know he would never walk out of town as a hero again. As the police led him away, he glanced at Eleanor. She didn't avoid that look. No scolding, no anger, just a nod, as if sending back to him all the years of lies. Outside the courthouse, the Red Hollow community was divided into two groups. Some said, "He couldn't have done that, I don't believe it." Others just looked up at the sky, sighing. This should have come a long time ago. As for Eleanor, she walked slowly down the steps, clutching the pocket where the piece of paper still lay, warmed by her body heat. She didn't celebrate, but in her heart, a door had closed, not to bury anything, but to protect what had just been restored. The truth. No need for a body, no need for blood, just a mother who refused to be silent, and a memory that had never been forgotten. 6 months after the trial, Red Hollow entered a quiet spring. The early spring winds carried the smell of damp earth and gentle rays of sunshine, not as harsh as the memories of yesteryear, but warm enough for the trees to sprout on paths thought to be barren. St. Alora's, the town's old chapel, was no longer a place of preaching, but a new space, the Rose Room, a community library named after a child who never had the chance to grow up. There was no ribbon cutting, no colorful flowers. The opening ceremony only had candlelight, the slow sound of violins echoing in the vaulted space, and the people who had contributed to turning over the buried story. The brick walls still retained their original color, but inside there was a new wooden bookshelf system, proper reading tables, and a small corner dedicated to children, where a photo of Abigail was lightly hung on the wall, her bright face holding the Sailor Moon comic book as the last day people saw her. Eleanor sat in the third row, this time not needing to hide. She wore a light gray wool dress, pinning a sprig of dried lavender on her chest. Her face was still stern, but her gaze had ceased to question. It only had stillness, like a lake that had just stopped rippling. When the music stopped, a young woman stood up to read the inscription on the stone wall near the main door, where the base of the lectern used to be, for those who have been silent, and those who refuse to be silent. The whole room was so quiet that people could clearly hear the maple leaves outside the yard falling onto the roof tiles. Jacob sat a row behind Eleanor, wearing a white shirt and a light-colored coat, no longer an investigator, but now carrying a new responsibility. Head of the Independent Civil Investigation Board of Mapleton State. After the trial, he refused all media interviews, but agreed to only one condition: to continue investigating forgotten cases and to re-ask questions in places where people had said, "It's over." Linda Voss, now living under a different name in a different town, had been placed in a witness protection program. In a handwritten letter to Eleanor, she wrote, "I don't demand forgiveness, but thanks to you, I no longer feel like I'm just someone who gave up." That letter was pressed by Eleanor between the last page of the notebook Thomas had written, like a small, late apology, but necessary. After the ceremony, everyone left in silence. No one carried balloons, there was no cake. Only a few children played in the backyard, and adults lingered a little longer before Abigail's photo, as if, finally, they dared to look. Eleanor returned home as the sun began to set. The old house on the edge of town still stood as a silent witness to time. No new paint, no replaced roof, but the small soil bed under the window had just been tilled. She knelt down, her hands wearing gardening gloves, carefully placing each lavender plant recently purchased at the early season farmer's market. The light purple flowers that Abigail used to say, "Mom, this flower smells like a dream." That dream had once turned into a nightmare, but now it was blooming again, branch by branch. After watering, Eleanor went into the kitchen. Like an old habit, she placed 2 cups of tea on the wooden table by the window, one with sugar, one without. But this time, she didn't make it to wait. No longer fragile hope in each sip of cold tea. She made it because she remembered, because she wanted to keep a part of Abby. In every morning, every quiet evening, every tiptoeing sound on the wooden floor she still heard in her dreams. Thomas's old recording device, returned to Eleanor after the trial ended, lay in the wooden desk drawer. She didn't open it anymore. She had heard enough. Enough to know she wasn't crazy. Enough to believe her daughter would never be forgotten. That night, before going to bed, she stepped out onto the porch, looking at the silent lavender plants under the moonlight. The scent drifted lightly on the wind. Eleanor closed her eyes. She whispered something, not a prayer, not a vow, but a promise. "I couldn't save you that day, Abby, but I didn't let them bury the truth with you." In that small town, where the church bell had been silent for 15 years, now the library was lit until late at night. Children came to read books. Adults re-examined old cases. And the first civil investigation reports had begun to be sent out, with the signature of someone who had been marginalized. Memory was no longer something to forget, but the only thing that helps a community understand that. There are losses that don't need a grave. They just need a place to be remembered. The Rose Room, for those who refuse to be silent.